wonderful people out there, and welcome back to another edition of Exploring Our Founding Documents from Penn Yan Public Library. I'm Adult Services Librarian Alex Androsik, here to talk to you about something a little bit different today, less a founding document of our American system of government and more an aspirational document from within the international community, namely the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. December is Human Rights Month in recognition of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights back in the 1940s. And so we are going to talk about that document today, which you can see being held up there by our pal, Eleanor Roosevelt. And we'll talk a bit more about her role in a moment. So what is a bit of the background and history of this declaration? Well, it was one of the first major initiatives of the United Nations. It's the kind of thing that it's coming out of that international community. It's not the product of any one nation, one superpower, one economic system. It was really a team effort born out of a desire not to repeat the absolute carnage that the world had just seen as part of the Second World War, which itself had dwarfed the records of the previous global conflict, which had been known as the War to End All Wars, World War I, until the Second World War came along and kind of put it to shame in terms of lives lost, cities leveled, lives ruined, between the Holocaust occurring during World War II and the dropping of the atomic bombs. It was just carnage on a scale previously unknown in human history. And so the United Nations was one response to this. And within the United Nations, we had this drive to create a document that would strive to appeal to the better angels of our human nature so that this kind of thing wouldn't happen again. The drafting of the document was directed by an 18-member commission representing very wide political, cultural, and religious diversity, and chaired by none other than Eleanor Roosevelt. She was the widow of a president. She was a highly, highly admired international figure. And so she was put in charge of this commission to draft the declaration, and she was really one of its driving forces. Within the commission, the declaration itself was drafted by a committee that boasted membership from 8 UN member states, which were selected with due regard for geographical distribution, which is just a nice way of saying they didn't pick all Europeans or all North Americans. And the declaration was composed and adopted in just 2 years, which I don't know if you're keeping score, but that is something of an amazing achievement, considering we were right at the start of the Cold War. And yes, representatives of the Soviet Union were a part of this. Representatives of China were a part of this. It really was a global effort. And I think an articulation of what was believed to be the future of diplomacy, of international relations, or at least was hoped to be. Upon the adoption of the declaration, one of its primary drafters, Hernan Santa Cruz of Chile, said, "I perceived clearly that I was participating in a truly significant historic event in which a consensus had been reached as to the supreme value of the human person, a value that did not originate in the decision of a worldly power, but rather in the fact of existing, which gave rise to the inalienable right to live free from want and oppression and to fully develop one's personality. In the Great Hall, there was an atmosphere of genuine solidarity and brotherhood among men and women from all latitudes, the like of which I have not seen again in any international setting." And really think about this statement and what Mr. Santa Cruz is saying here. There's some pretty radical notions in what he's saying as being embedded in the Declaration of Human Rights. Rights emanating just from the fact of existing. It's not based on citizenship. It's not based on gender. It's not based on class. It's not based on race. The fact that you exist gives you these rights. And I like that he includes in here, free from want and oppression, and to fully develop one's personality. It's a statement of going beyond simply surviving and just eking out a meager existence. And it's saying a part of your human rights is to develop, is to become the best you that you can be. And I think that's really incredible. I think it's also important to point out that women shaped this declaration. We're not going to go into it in too much depth right now, but I really would impel everyone to go to the United Nations Human Rights page, where they have all kinds of references and information about the Declaration. And there is a page within that site on women's impact on the Declaration. And just to give you a couple of examples, Hansa Mehta, who you can see on the far right of this picture, she's credited with changing the phrase, all men are born free and equal, to all human beings are born free and equal in the first article of the Declaration. And it's just kind of amazing that, you know, all of these diplomats and world leaders and philosophers sat down to hammer out this declaration, and none of the men in the room thought, gee, maybe now's the time to change that little convention we use of just referring to everybody as men. This very simple statement that erases more than half of the human population. And this woman from India was really the driving force behind removing that from the common conception and swapping it with all human beings. And then another person who's not pictured here, a woman named Advokia Uralova, who was from the what is now Belarus. It was the Soviet holding at the time. She, for example, was committed to equal pay for women, which resulted in Article 23 of the document, which states that everyone without any discrimination has the right to equal pay for equal work. And think how radical that was for the 1940s, and it's a aspiration that has not been fully achieved today. So there are so many other stories. Of course, Eleanor Roosevelt herself being a driving factor in the Declaration as a whole. Each of these women pictured here, and then so many others, had contributions to shaping the Declaration. So I'd really recommend you take a look at that. Talk a little bit about the legacy. On the Human Rights page of the UN, they talk about Human Rights Day, and that was last week. We just kind of missed it, but you know, it's always okay to celebrate, no matter what time of year it is. And so this is celebrating the day in 1948 that the General Assembly adopted the Declaration. And as they say here, it was a milestone document which proclaims the inalienable rights that everyone is entitled to as a human being, regardless of all of these classifications: race, color, religion, sex, language, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Love that they include other status, the recognition that in time the world would recognize that there are other statuses than just these delineated here. As a gay man, I appreciate that. And it's available in more than 500 languages, so it's the most translated document in the world. Think about that. It's more translated than the Bible. It's more translated than Game of Thrones. So this is truly a fundamental document that people all over the world look to. Now, being a declaration is not law. It has no legal standing. It's not binding, but it is part of what's called customary international law, and it can be used to exert diplomatic and moral pressure. So if you're a member of the United Nations and your country is doing something that does not live up to the standards laid out in the Declaration, that can be the basis for other members coming around and saying, like, you know, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? This is not appropriate. If you want to be a member in good standing, you've got to clean up your act. More tangibly, the Declaration has been cited directly in at least 28 national constitutions, and it has been referred to in at least 94 cases across the American legal system. So, you know, people drafting the constitutions of their country look to the Declaration for guidance, and even our own legal system looks to it in service of administering the law of our country. And it forms the basis of many fundamental international rights treaties. So while the Declaration itself has no legal force, these treaties do. And just two examples of that are the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. So I think we're going to get ready to just write out by hand the preamble of the Declaration. And it's in 3 parts. I split it up as evenly as I could to make it big enough so you can see it nice and clear on your screen. So as always, this is the part that's inspired by our Handwriting the Constitution art project that inspired this whole ongoing program. And so I invite you to pull out your piece of paper, your pen or your pencil, and feel free to pause on this screen until you have handwritten this text out. And just as you're writing, become very familiar with the words on the page, sink into the meaning of the words, and hopefully come to a greater appreciation of what the preamble says, laying out the fundamental assumptions and aspirations of the Declaration. And after you have written what's on this page, unpause yourself and we'll go on to the next one. So go ahead and pause and we'll be back when you're ready. All right, hope you all took enough time to write out part 1. Here we have part 2 of the preamble. And so go ahead and pause me again and write out this part. All right, welcome back. And here we have part 3 of the preamble. And pause here, write out this portion, and then play again. All right, hope you took enough time to really dig into what you were writing here with the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I hope it made you a little bit thoughtful. And if it did make you thoughtful, we have some reflection questions that you can think back on in the months to come. And so I've referred to this a few times as an aspirational document. And so I guess the first question you can think about is, do you feel the aspirations set forth in the preamble have been successfully implemented? And do you see or feel its effects anywhere in your life or in the observation of the world? And I know we've just covered the preamble here. We're gonna tackle the articles in a future session or in several future sessions. But for now, you know, the preamble sets forth, just like the preamble of our founding documents here in the United States. You know, it's the founding principles of the document that are put forth in the preamble. So how do you think those have been achieved or not? And then, of course, you know, it's probably obvious to you that not every aspect of the Declaration gets to be borne out in everyday life around the world. But is there value in stating these aspirations, or does our failure as a species to achieve them only lead to disappointment and recrimination? So to your mind, is it good that we have this document, whether or not we are living up to it, or does that create more problems? And as I was researching this topic, I found a lot of opinion pieces and things where I think people really grapple with this question and they really struggle with what it means that we've had this on the books, so to speak, since 1948. And there are so many nations in pretty flagrant violation of it, even nations that you would expect to, you know, hold to a higher standard, some whose initials include the letters US and A a lot of the times. And keeping that in mind, why do you think it's so difficult for individuals and governments to live in accordance with the values set forth in this declaration? Why can't we get our act together? And then acknowledging that it is so difficult, nevertheless, we are all beings capable of great, you know, personal action and change, and we all have agency in this. So I leave you with this reflection question: what actions can you take in your everyday life to advance the ideals embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Because turning back to Mrs. Roosevelt, the wonderful Eleanor, I love this quote here: where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. So I urge you to follow Eleanor Roosevelt's advice and at least begin to start living out the ideals of the Declaration of Human Rights in your own homes and wherever else you find yourself, at work, in the voting booth, and in these kinds of places. So I'll leave you with that. I hope you enjoyed this exploration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this sort of is a good opportunity for me to say that we're gonna, go more in this direction in 2022. I can't believe we're up to 2022 already. You may have noticed, we got away from simply exploring America's founding documents and even just documents based in the United States. And we're gonna lean into that in 2022. We are now going to be looking at fundamental rights documents on a spectrum through history. We're gonna sort of take a historical tour through the documents that at least intended to grant greater rights to individuals and to groups as history progressed. So we're going to be looking at things like the Magna Carta. We're going to be looking at things like the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, which due to holiday style shenanigans at the end of November when I was planning all this, I conflated the the Universal Declaration of Rights of Human Rights with the Declaration of the Rights of Man. So if you came to this looking for the French document, rest assured we will get to it next year. And we're going to try to span the whole globe, and not just the Western world, and not just the English-speaking world, and not just the European world, but we're going to try to dig into other ways of thinking and other ways of granting rights. And we're going to think about how this project has worked out over time and where we are, whether we've made progress, what progress there is still to make. And I am hopeful that we can get through a good selection of those. And then what I would like to do, thinking ahead even further to 2023, amazingly, that we're going to be there, is to then dig into the actual articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we did the preamble today. There are 30 articles, so I could see us breaking those up into digestible chunks and covering pieces of them over time. So I do hope you will consider joining us for that. I'm looking forward to it. I'm really enjoying this format where we get to be together at different times. You can pause and control how long it takes you to get through this. You can skip all of my bupkis if you want to, and just get to the handwriting part. As always, greatly thankful for the inspiration that Handwriting the Constitution gave to me to pursue this. And I am grateful to those of you who have watched and participated. And I hope to see you all next year and beyond. So thanks so much. We'll see you in 2022.